to Talking Churchill. I'm Richard Toye, and in this episode I'll be interviewing Warren Dockter about his recently published book, Churchill and the Islamic World. So Warren, so many books have been written about Churchill, but this is a new topic. How did you come to it?
Thank you very much, Richard. And I'm glad that you asked that question. I think it's very important. I mean, in many ways, this idea came from a conversation I had with my PhD supervisor, Professor Chris Wrigley, at the University of Nottingham. And we were discussing Churchill's first book, The Malacan Field Force, and we discussed Churchill's first encounter with Islamic extremism. And then we started talking about his second book, The River War, and how this also dealt with Islamic extremism. And so it sort of grew from that, and we began considering how these early experiences affected Churchill's view of Muslims and of the sort of what Churchill would call the Islamic world. And, we started following this through to his role as, how did it affect his role as colonial secretary or his role as prime minister in the Second World War. And so the ideas were sort of born from that. And, of course, while we were sort of looking into this, I was also doing research on the historiography, and it became very clear that sorts of misconceptions existed in not just the scholarship, but also how it was popularly represented.
So, in your view, Churchill's views of Islam have been misrepresented in previous scholarship and in what is often said about him publicly.
Yes, that's right. I think that there is a gap in the literature because when academics deal with questions of Churchill and the Muslim world, they tend to rely on very specific scraps of evidence that were provided in Martin Gilbert's companion volumes, when in fact it's a much more varied and much more sympathetic picture. And so the book really sets out to sort of address this in the academic sphere, but not just the academic sphere. To also address it in the popular sphere, where Churchill's legacy has been used and hijacked by various political organizations who want to sort of paint Churchill as Islamophobic, both in the Islamic world itself, where mullahs on the far right try to show that Britain is intolerant towards Muslim, using a man voted the greatest Briton to sort of illustrate this, as well as people on the far right in Britain. And so what my book does is it tries to erase these sort of popular misconceptions and misinterpretations and examine the sort of historical reality of Churchill's relationship with the Islamic world and with Muslims. And it turns out that his views are much more sympathetic than you might have thought.
Okay, so Churchill was in some ways more favourable to Islam and towards Muslims than is generally thought. But is it not the case that in some ways this was purely instrumental, and so that, for example, with regards to India, he backed the Muslims because he saw them as an opposing force to the Hindu nationalists of the Congress?
That's certainly correct. Churchill certainly did have a political agenda, particularly in the 1930s when he took up the notion of Muslim civil rights as a sort of part of his political strategy to keep India within the British Empire. But that's not to say that the certain times when his sort of political machinations lined up with British Muslims, that he still didn't have a genuine sort of interest and sort of genuine sympathy for the Islamic world. And you can see this again play out at times in the Second World War when he explains that in fact, he explains incorrectly that the majority of the British army was made up of Muslims in India. This is, of course, totally incorrect. The majority were Hindus at the time. But he was saying this to President Roosevelt. So it's a mixed bag. I mean, like in all things, as we know, with regard to Winston Churchill, it's quite paradoxical. But at times he was very, very sympathetic to Muslims and to the Muslim world, and at other times it was purely strategic. And so the point of the book is to sort of to illustrate the nuance surrounding the topic.
And so, to what extent do you think that Churchill was special or unique in his views of Islam? What were the kind of discourses of the time that he fitted in with, or was perhaps different from, when he was discussing these issues?
I think Winston Churchill occupies a very unique space as it relates to his views on Muslims. Because they're a sort of strange combination of the standard Victorian prejudices, the sort of romantic notion of the noble Bedouin, is all sort of wrapped up in this. But additionally, he has quite sympathetic and fairly progressive ideas for a Victorian or Edwardian. Of course, by the sort of post-war era, his views, of course, become anachronistic. But it is interesting. There are, of course, people far to the left of him and far more progressive in their views of Islam. Wilfrid Blunt, a good friend of Winston Churchill's, is a great example of that. There were people far to the right of Winston Churchill, people like Frederick Ludgard, who used punitive expeditions, and whom Churchill fought to stop those punitive expeditions. And so you see a sort of unique Churchillian blend, and this sort of runs throughout Churchill's career, in part because, as you had pointed out, his views towards Muslims were instrumental, and so he had to be pragmatic. But at other times, there was a genuine curiosity and sympathy that he harbored for sort of the East. And you can see this in the fact that he returns to Morocco several times, even well after the war, to paint, and because he's very interested in painting the landscapes, and often these include, of course, images and of bazaars and mosques. And so I think it's important to know that Churchill's was certainly unique in his views, that it was a combination of reaction and a combination of progressive ideas that ultimately created a view that was uniquely Churchillian.
Thank you very much, Warren, and please do join us again for another episode of Talking Churchill.